Ladies and gentlemen, Luke Johnson, Bob Schut. What is this, our 10th installment of Soren Kierkegaard's Works of Love?
That sounds about right.
Yeah.
10.
All right, so I believe you are going to finish up from where we left off in episode 9, and then I'll be taking it over once you do that.
Okay, sounds good. So I'm going to start off today with reading a little quote here from Kierkegaard, page 145, 146 of my version here. He says, as far as secular mentality is concerned, a far more certain way of making sure and having positive certainty that there is a God would be to have a picture of him hung up. Then one could see that God is, or that there is an idol, which nevertheless does not exist. So it's kind of an idea. People always want certainty that God exists. And I thought it was kind of funny. He says, well, if you can hang a picture of God up on your wall, and that should convince you. I'm not sure how convincing that would be. I don't know if we could. Yeah, I don't think we could fit him in an 8x5, but I guess we all have certain pictures of God up on our walls, don't we?
Well, right. I mean, if the wall is metaphorical, and that raises an interesting theological question that I would like you to weigh in on. So the Bible instructs us to not make any sort of graven images. Does that prohibit an actual creation of the image of Jesus Christ? And if it doesn't, what do you think about the accuracy of the images that we have of Jesus Christ? Because, there's a lot of people in Christian movements that want to say Jesus was actually black. There are people who want to say that he was Palestinian. There are some people who want to say that he's Caucasian. They kind of want him to reflect whatever ethnicity that they come from, rather than, most likely case, right, that he would have been sort of Middle Eastern looking, right? I mean, what's your take on these issues?
Okay, two-part question. I have no idea what Jesus looked like, and I don't think that. I know that the TV one time tried to create a replica of what Jesus would have looked like based upon, I guess, averaging out the Jewish, what they knew of the Jewish look at that time, first century, and then they put together a collage, I guess, of different pieces and came up with a person and said this is probably what he looked like. I think that's ridiculous. To take, to say, well, what does any person, what does a Chinese person look like? Well, let's take all the Chinese people and blend them all together and create an image, and that's what this particular Chinese person must have looked like. That's absurd to me. I mean, maybe I'm missing the point somewhere, but to me, that's not what Jesus looked like. We don't have any idea. He could have looked just like many people, many Jewish people. Some of them look very, very Caucasian, and some of them look very, very Asian, very Oriental. And there's just such a wide variety of people. I don't think we have any idea, and nor should we. And the second part of that image, whether we have an image in our mind of the physical Jesus or we hang a picture of him up on the wall, is not really the issue. What the issue is really if we worship it. So if we hang a picture of a white Jesus or a black Jesus or an Asian Jesus up on the wall, and we get down on our knees and pray to that image, then we're really in danger of missing the whole point. That's not what we're supposed to be doing. What we're supposed to be doing is worshiping the spiritual image of Christ, the works, the teachings, the man too, inclusive of what he did for us and who he was, not his physical traits. Okay, so that's really.
So you don't have any problem with religious artwork. You think that's in conflict with any of the scripture about not making graven images or anything like that? And I know that there's this movement within evangelical churches to even get rid of crosses.
Well, there's always the iconoclastic movement that went on, and even even back, and I don't know what the year was where they went into all the churches and they broke all the images and burned anything that looked or resembled like an image. And I'm not saying it was justified or not. When you have statues of Jesus and you kiss their feet and you pray to them and you decorate them, I think you're in danger. And I'll just put it that way. I think you're in danger of idol worship.
Okay.
Now we go back to the Old Testament. An interesting story I'm sure that you read, or someone of the group read, was the story of the golden serpent that Moses was instructed by God when they were attacked, I guess you would say, were overcome by these poisonous snakes. And Moses asked God for help, and he said, build I think it was a bronze serpent, and hold it over the people, hold this image over the people, and those who look upon it will be saved from the bite of the serpents.
Mm.
Now that's a very interesting story, isn't it? God forbids the worship of images, yet he uses an image in order to save the people. So nothing is simple.
No.
But they didn't worship the serpent, and then they eliminated it. Or I'm sure there's some cult that claims they've got this actual serpent. You know how things are. But that's the idea. The idea is that we're not to worship them. We're supposed to keep it clear in our head. Christ is in the kingdom of heaven, and that's the whole purpose of this, not to become attached to a photograph of him or statue of him or anybody else that's a created image. So, yeah.
That's a good distinction. I have a story about that I'll tell you one day. So why don't you keep going back to the Kierkegaard stuff?
Oh, okay. So consider that Christ did not try to prove himself using externals. If he did, he failed. This is exactly what tests or proves faith. This is what the devil tempted Jesus with when he wanted him to demonstrate that he was, in fact, the Son of God. So he goes back to the internals and the externals, and he talks about, well, look at Jesus. What did Jesus do? Did he try to prove himself really using externals, or did he really try to prove using internals? I think there we have, again, a little bit of a conflict because, well, yeah, he did do healings and he did perform external miraculous events, but did he do it to prove he was the Son of God? Well, maybe.
Sometimes.
But, yeah, so yeah, there might have been occasion that he did use externals. But with Jesus, he was kind of bridging two worlds together. He was bringing the external world of Judaism at the time where sacrifices were offered and the externals of the temple, the externals of the priesthood. And he was fusing that idea into the internals, which was the Christian church. So he's kind of got one foot in one, which he lived at the end of the one period, and he brought about the new period. So I think we have to consider that as well, that this was a time where he was a bridge between the two externals and the internals. So we can see that, but he refused to do the externals when people demanded it as a sign. It was okay when he did it on his own, but when it's demanded of him as a sign, he said, I'm not going to perform magic for you guys. This isn't a sideshow. Mm-hmm. And he did the same thing with the devil when the devil tempted him in the wilderness. He fought back and he said, I'm not going to turn these stones into bread. And I'm not going to throw myself off the cliff. I'm not going to prove I'm the Son of Man, the Son of God. I'm sorry, the Son of God. And so that's where Kierkegaard is drawing on that. But I just thought I'd throw those other ideas in because I'm sure some people out there were wondering, well, but didn't he really do this? Yeah, he did. But we have to see the context of those events.
He did say that, he would do some things, right, so that you may believe. I believe is the exact, some of the phrasing along those lines, right?
Yeah, it's to create a situation of faith. the miracles were really brought about so they could see that he was closely related to Yahweh, closely related to Jehovah. The miracles that he performed, such as healing, was to say the healer has now come to you. Because when John the Baptist, even whether he doubted or not isn't the issue, but he questioned Jesus and he sent a message to one of his disciples, said, are you the Messiah or is there one yet to come? And he said, go back and tell John, you know, the crippled are healed, and so forth. So he performed those miracles for the sake of showing that he was the Messiah in one form or another. But it wasn't proof. They were signs that he was giving. Signs just like God heals. He says, I heal because my Father in heaven heals. So they were signs that he was associated to God, but they weren't proof for people. And they weren't meant to be proof. He didn't want people to believe because of the signs. He even said that.
Yeah.
He wanted people to believe because of who he was. So he says Kierkegaard says, spiritual love cannot be externalized because it's a love of inwardness. But this kind of thinking offends the world. Christianity has one decisive element, and he's going to bring up now some externals that somebody out there might be thinking and challenging. So, well, wait a second. Doesn't Christianity have externals? What about baptism? That's something external, isn't it? I mean, you can't really become a member of the Christian community unless you become baptized. So what about that? So he addresses that. He says that where Christianity has inwardness, Christendom has outwardness. And where they have inwardness, Christianity has outwardness. So he's in one of the few places, he's now comparing what he calls the difference between Christianity and Christendom, and I think the Christendom idea is more the political church, specifically the political church in Denmark, but I think it can be applied to any church that has kind of crossed over from the spiritual world into the physical political world and has become a political power. And politics, of course, is a very, difficult word to define, but it's not necessarily whatever a person thinks politics is. I think that what he's getting at here is that the sacrament of baptism was and is considered something inward rather than something outward. So for those people who think that baptism is an external thing, that's not correct. It may be performed externally, but it doesn't have any effect externally. Only when it's inwardly understood does it have an effect on the individual. And in my opinion, I think that he's justifying that infant baptism is taking away from the outward sign of an adult undergoing the sacrament. The reason it's more an outward sign on an infant is that it's not an expression of the infant's faith. It's an expression of an adult's faith. There's no connection that the infant has with it. It's an external thing performed upon the infant. I mean, just like if that same infant was born to some pagan tribe and they were somehow given some sort of a ritual over that infant, would that child, because of that ritual, become a pagan? I don't think so. I don't think you can project that Christianity into someone else. That's my own belief on that. Such an expression as an adult may be taken as an offense to if you're in a church that performs baptism, it might be considered offensive and a sign of humility, or not humility, but a sign of offense to one's dignity, since it's regularly something that's done by infants and children. So to have an adult be baptized, it's like, why should I undergo baptism, this is just something for infants and little kids that should be baptized. I'm an adult. I don't need that kind of a ritual performed on me. So there might be that that thought upon an adult not wanting to participate in something that's for little kids. So that's the danger of it as well.
One day, I'm sorry to interrupt, but one day we're going to have to unravel the mystery of who John the Baptist was, because he's not an Old Testament prophet, and he's not Jesus. He's this transitional figure. I don't quite know how to think. I don't really have a category for him. Do you have a rough and ready one available?
Well, there isn't exactly a single category for him, because he existed in that transitionary state, like I'm saying as well. He was the greatest among men born, according to Jesus. And that's because he was the last and final prophet of that age. And now Jesus was bringing the world into a new age. And so John brought it up to that point, but he couldn't go any further with it. And so, yeah, he was that transitioner. He was able to pass it on to Jesus in a sense through the baptism. He was able to declare the Messiah has now arrived. And I am the last one. I am, what was it? Elijah, in a sense. He is the spirit of Elijah, the spirit of those prophets. So the greatest prophet was John the Baptist, because he's the one who actually introduced the Messiah to the world. So there's no real category for him.
So many questions.
Yeah. Then he says Christianity knows only one kind of love, and that's the spiritual love. And this lies, the spiritual lies at the base of all other love. A person's impressions of life, experiences of, let me read that again. A person's impressions of life experiences of all men that he ever met does not allow him to see man, in quotes. So when we say, if we were to meet every man in the world and talk to him and interview him, would we really meet man, in quotes? And I think he's getting at the idea of man. The spirit of man. No, we wouldn't, because that's something invisible. We would see examples of man, but we wouldn't see man itself. Christian love is the same in that it does not let us see Christian love specifically. Christian love is embedded in other kinds of love. It doesn't exist specifically so that you can say, let me see Christian love, only Christian love. It's not really possible, because it's embedded in love of neighbor, love of self, love of others, the erotic love. It's embedded in all these loves, is what he's trying to teach us here. We know that one difference with Christian love is that one loves his enemy. And this is something that he says can't be found in other loves. And this is very unique. And you did the Sermon on the Mount. And what was your reaction to that? If I could just kind of interrupt myself here. What was your reaction? Because I'll be teaching on that in my own Bible study coming up very soon. Teaching love of enemy. So I'm interested to hear what other people think of that.
I had read it maybe a year ago, and I remember finding it very, very refreshing. And I read it. I read it a couple days ago, and I remember finding it very difficult for some reason. I think I'll have to look back at it, but there's a great deal of difficulty in it. Before, I felt challenged by it rather than relieved by it this time around. And I can't remember what. It's not so much the loving the enemy. It's not so much the emphasis on not having possessions or being rich or something like that. That doesn't see, there was something else early on in it that I was like, man, I'm really gonna have to wrestle with that. Let me pull it up and let me see if I can find what I was wrestling with. Why don't you continue your thought?
Oh, okay. When you said that, you put a memory in my mind. I saw a movie, a beautiful movie, actually. It's not necessarily a Christian movie, but it's about loving your enemy. I think it's called Enemy Mine. And it's about an alien and I guess it's about the Earth, and the aliens were fighting a war. And I think they both got wounded, an alien, and they were fighting each other. And they both got wounded, I think. And somehow they met, and they were ready to kill each other, and they didn't have the same language, and they met, and they became friends, and there became this bond between the two of them. A beautiful movie. It's I think something that Christians should watch, this particular movie. I really liked it. Enemy Mine, I don't remember who was in it. But so man has never seen Christian love in the same sense that we have never seen man. In other words, we can't just extract Christian love and look at it and see what it's like exactly. We can only theorize over it. We can generalize it, just like we generalize mankind. Christianity hasn't altered anything in love, but yet it transforms everything by its nature. And this is, again, I think he's trying to explain and describe the internal nature of love as a Christian. It doesn't change love, so to speak, but what happens to us is there's a transformation process that takes place, and we see everything differently, and our nature even becomes changed and altered.
Oh, can I kind of interject real quick?
Sure, right there. Go ahead.
So some of the things that stuck out to me this time around that were harder for me to swallow. Trying to understand the nature. I mean, not that I have a real issue for this, but trying to offer counsel for people and how as far as divorce and adultery goes. Yeah. The idea of swearing oaths, and I was thinking about this because I read it I think I read it on the 4th of July, and I think about the oaths that we swear to this country, the Pledge of Allegiance, and how that fits in with this idea of America being this New Jerusalem or it not being. Mm-hmm. I think that was something that was hard for me to sort out. There was something else. The emphasis on the narrowness of the gate, and how Jesus seems to be like really demanding of us, like it's really going to be so few of us, and you really need to cut off your hand and gouge out your eye if it's really becoming a problem. Yeah. These can be really hard things to swallow. So as much comfort as I find in the Sermon on the Mount, there's a lot of strong medicine in it too.
Oh yeah, it's very confrontational, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the first time I read it, it made me feel really good. The second time I read it, I was like, "Oh God, I'm not good enough."
Yeah. That's beautiful. Actually, that's the humility, and now you've seen it from a different point of view. It's easy, some people read it and they say, yeah, that's kind of cool, nice thoughts, nice ivory tower thoughts, nice maybe system of ethics we should aspire to, maybe, but not really seriously to live by it. They're not practical ethics. It's just a nice system of ethics. So is that how we take what Jesus teaches? What he says is, well, there are suggestions, and we might try, but we know we're not going to make it. Or are they demands that he's making upon us? And if they are demands, then how do we respond to those demands? So that's our homework assignment. Read the Sermon on the Mount and see how you react to it, and see if it makes you want to aspire to it, or makes you just want to make pretty doilies and hang pretty embroideries of some of his sayings and hang them up, like love your neighbor, but don't make one that says if your right hand offends you, cut it off. I've never seen an embroidery with that saying on it, Luke.
No.
I've never seen a plaque in somebody's house saying, if your right hand offends you, cut it off. Why is that?
It's pretty hard to lead with that. When you have people over and you're having coffee cake. Oh yeah. There's this other thing Jesus said. Maybe we should all go cut our hands off.
Yeah. But he's at least in there. He's certainly telling us what our attitude ought to be towards sin. And it wasn't complacent, to say the least. So now he called the pure heart. He says a pure heart is not a free heart. So pure versus free. It's actually a bound heart. So people think of a pure heart, perhaps, or the human heart, something that's freedom. We have freedom. And we covered this in some of the, what was the book that we covered?
The Concept of Anxiety. Is that what we did?
Maybe it was in the Concept of Anxiety. But all the sayings that Kierkegaard had, remember the book that we had of all his sermons, but they weren't.
The 18 Upbuilding Discourses.
Yeah, and the Upbuilding Discourses, I think we covered this in some of James's works when he went over James's work. The idea is we are not free. We don't have free hearts when we become Christian. We have bound hearts. So he's going to explain that. He says, in a pure heart, it's not the same thing as a free heart because it's bound to God. It's like a ship that tries to sail away with its anchors dropped. You're not going to get very far when you try to sail away with the anchor down in the mud. The heart is bound to God. So if the heart is to be pure, it must be limitlessly bound to God. Limitlessly bound to God. In other words, a pure heart must be completely bound to God, where we do not, even if we have it, which I'm not going to admit, even if we have free will, the Christian cannot exercise it, not in those terms. Our freedom is to be bound to will, bound to God. It's giving up our free will to be bound to God's will. That's what Kierkegaard teaches, and that's what I believe as well.
You know what's so crazy is that I think a lot of Christians take it for granted that we do have free will. But I'm listening to I've been listening to a lot of Luther's works lately.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember the one that I'm listening to right now. I've got it on LibriVox, which I recommend people checking out. But the whole essay, it's called The Bondage of the Will.
Right.
And the whole book, he is adamant that we do not have free will.
Right.
I did not know that was a central teaching of Luther, the so-called the founder of Protestantism.
Yeah, and it's funny because I teach in the Lutheran church, and I hear so many people talk about, but I have free will, and I don't just kind of approach everybody, because I'd be discussing these things all day long, But yeah, it's interesting. And again, I'm not saying we don't, but I'm saying that if we do, our will should be bound to God. In other words, if we had it, we would have to give it up in order to be bound to God. So it becomes a moot point for the Christian. Whether he has free will or not, he doesn't exercise it. Not in the same way that a person in the world who might truly or deceptively think he has free will. That, as Luther teaches, all that means is man chooses to sin because he can do nothing else. Right?
Yeah, I'm interested. I've been listening to Luther. I'm listening to him build his case. I don't know. I see both perspectives. I see, when I read the Bible, I see talk of the elect and God's foreknowledge, but then I also, I see, Jesus wants us to choose him, and we wouldn't really be able to authentically choose him or authentically love him if, we were overdetermined. So I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm a compatibilist of some nature. I think this raises interesting questions about how definite the future is too. So,
well, yeah, sometimes one of the ways to interpret scripture or understand it is to harmonize. We see two different things that seem incompatible and we try to make them compatible. And sometimes there's a big price to pay when we do that. My feeling is I think we need to understand each element more clearly if they're not compatible and decide what is being said here. And so one of these days we'll talk about free will, bound will, and how God's will all kind of work together, and whether or not man has the freedom to choose God, or whether that's something God chooses for man. We can talk about that, which is an interesting, at least the way I think about it, may be a little different than others, but we don't have time for that. I don't even want to open that door today, but someday, hopefully in the future, we can discuss that. That's a very interesting question. So the master can die. Like if you are bound to something, it says the master can die and the servant's obligations will cease. But the problem is God never dies. So if we're bound to God, there is no release from this bondage of the will. And the bond is never broken. So the heart must be bound for eternity. And this is love. This bond is love for God and God's love for us. According to scripture, which comes first? God's love for us or our love for God? God's love for us,
yeah,
comes first. Okay, and that's an important element in what we were just saying. That's a clue. Freedom has never been denied in love by Christianity, but there is an infinite bond that must exist if the heart of the lover and the beloved are to be pure. So if we want an erotic love or a familiar love or a friendship love, and we want it to be pure, then the only way we can have that love be pure is to begin with a pure love towards God. So there must be this infinite bond with God. God has first priority in our lives, and that's kind of what this means. This means it's a demand. Everything is pledged as collateral under this priority. Everything. It's not a partial commitment to God. It's a full and total commitment to God. Interestingly, I think it's kind of like a filling in the sense that in the beginning, our cups are small and they can only hold so much. But whatever they do hold, they need to be full. And as we get more mature, our cups become bigger and they can hold more. And yet they still now have room to be filled even more, at least quantitatively filled. But that's how my life seems to be. When I started, I was filled, but my cup was so small. But as I grew as a Christian, my cup became larger, more able to handle more things and understand more things. So the cup got bigger, but I have to maintain its fullness. So just kind of a visualization, I think, of what Kierkegaard is saying. But the free heart does not have those kinds of concerns. The heart that is infinitely bound to God has infinite concern. Even if we speak of love with our beloved, our first concern must be with our soul and our beloved's soul. And that kind of gets back to the idea of if we really love someone else, then that love for the Christian must take the form of evangelism in a sense, in some form, whether direct or indirect or modeling. It should be on our mind. I love this person. I want to bring them to the kingdom of God. That should always be on our mind, if it's pure love, if it's true love that we have. This concern must be both our first and last. Otherwise, we have guilt and sin, according to him. So he looks at this pretty harshly, that if we don't have this love for God first, it produces guilt in us because there's something wrong with it, and that wrongness is sin. So that's kind of where I am going to leave it and let you pass the baton on to you here now, Luke. So,
yeah, I may have covered some of the things that you already said here. So I'll just go over them very quickly. If they're a little, there might be a little wrinkle here and there, but then we'll get to the new material. So I picked it up on page 149 of the Harper Torch Books edition. And our translations may be a little different, but Kierkegaard contends that because the free heart harbors no concern, it plunges itself into the world of attachment. And if we contrast the state of affairs with the heart, which in the view of some is unfree, that is infinitely bound to God, such a heart has infinite concern. So, we're just to play with this idea, what does Kierkegaard mean here by infinite concern? Are those not drowning in a sea of finitude, concerned with things? What is the identifiable difference? And we get this quote from my 149. Kierkegaard writes, "The person who must every moment exercise the most complex concern is not bound by concern in such a way as is the heart infinitely bound to God." So what Kierkegaard appears to be saying here, if I understand him correctly, is that when one is infinitely bound to God, the concern is pure and simple. So when one concerns himself with the infinite, the concern is not divested into corrupted multiplicity. I don't think Kierkegaard intends to say that infinite concern is simple and easy. Otherwise, he wouldn't have written a book called Fear and Trembling. So we see now that the free heart is overwhelmed with thoughts. Since the goal of a great deal of this book is to think about our relation to others, we have to seriously ask ourselves how we can properly love others if there is so much concern for fractured reality. Kierkegaard thinks, as I'm sure we've mentioned numerous times before, that in the context of a relationship, one must be concerned with their soul in relation to God. Then your pure heart can be given away in erotic love, platonic love, familiar love. And as Bob was mentioning earlier, the concern for God has to be the thing that envelops the entire relationship, or inevitably we will incur guilt or sin. So I have some questions about this. Why would Kierkegaard say something like that? Is that necessarily true? Is it always the case that erotic love alone will culminate in guilt or sin? Is a similar course guaranteed with platonic love? My experience says yes, but I don't know if I'm being merely cynical. What do you think about this, Bob?
Well, you and I were talking earlier a little bit about sin, I think, and it depends upon how we look at sin. And I've given that a lot of thought. I really meditated on that idea of sin and what it is, and the words of Jesus, and how it was perceived through the Old Testament. And I think that when we see the act of sin, we are simply seeing the externalization of the sin. We're seeing the event of the sin, but we're not seeing the sin itself. It's like he talked about man. When you see an example of man, you're not really seeing man. You're seeing an example of man, an individual. And so I think when a person is put in a position where they have a love for another and don't have the love for God, it is sin, not because of the event or event that may happen. It may end in abuse, it may end in adultery, it may end in an example of sin, in an external example of sin. But the sin is already there because it's a relationship of man's will alone. So man's will carries with it the nature of sin. And I think this is true in Kierkegaard's teaching. This is what I've extracted from every source that I have, is that man's will carries with it the seed or the source of sin. So what we see externally as adultery is, and this is what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount too, he says, even if a man thinks about another woman, it's already a sin. It's already adultery. It's not in the act itself. It's in the nature of man's will to do that without God. And I think that's what he's getting at here. is that it's sin in that inevitably it will show itself, but it's a sin because God is not the source of this love.
Yeah, I would say that the word I would use to describe the Sermon on the Mount the second time I read it would be convicting.